Hey, and welcome to episode 4 of the Lost Souls podcast. I'm the host, Alex, and today we're going to be talking about wealth. Now, wealth isn't exactly this easy thing to put a pin on because it covers a lot of different things, but it's essentially, how much value you have as a person, right? That's what it ends up coming down to. How much economic value, right? Because this all gets tied up in like what kind of car you drive, what kind of house you own, what kind of clothes you wear, what kind of shoes you have, what kind of phone you have, right? All that, all that gets tied up in wealth. But the question you really need to ask in the first place is, why is it considered important, or so important? And it's because at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, money is what gets everything we have. It's that medium of exchange. There isn't really like bartering anymore, right? I don't trade 2 chickens for 3 cows, even though that would be a really bad trade. That doesn't happen anymore. You hand somebody money, they give you the thing. There really doesn't, like, don't get me wrong, sometimes, like, say in traditionally black market ways where things are kind of done under the table anyway, it's like the straight up trade happens. But even still, usually that trade's just relating to money anyway. It's like, I'll give you $20 of stuff for $20 worth of stuff, right? But, it buys our food, it buys our home, it buys the electricity that, people use, that you're using right now. It buys everything. It's what ends up being that payment method. And so, of course, if society runs on money for everything, wealth is going to be considered important, but it isn't exactly a good thing. It's not that it's a bad thing necessarily, it's just a thing, right? And it has good and bad qualities. The thing about wealth is it ends up really determining the place you have in a lot of different relationships, right? It can make or break all kinds of relationships, just because, like, there's a big difference between, like, social economic classes. There's a big difference between, like, what the standard of living, what people do with their time, and how just people present themselves depending on how much money either you grew up with or you currently have. And it creates a barrier between people understanding each other, because there's a reason that there's the poor, middle, and upper class, right? There's a reason there's that distinction between people, because they each lead very different lives. The poor, a lot of times, like, they'll struggle to get by. If you're poor, you've probably had your power cut off a couple times. If you're poor, you've probably went without food or been in, like, food, what's the word? Scarcity. Been in a food scarcity, there's a word I want to use for this, but I can't, it's not coming to me right now. Anyway, like, and those are just not issues that, like, people in higher classes have. Like, a poor person worries about whether or not they'll have a place to stay next month, and people in upper classes just don't. That's not something that concerns them. The middle class is, like, more worried about how I'm going to pay for vacation this year, right? Like, they have all their necessities met or whatever. They have the house, they have the car they want. The poor people are like, how the hell am I going to get a car to get around? They got to rely on, in, like, cities, they rely on public transportation, even though I think that's, in big cities, that's just a smart move. But, in other places, you kind of need a car to get around. And, these become real questions. A middle class family might just give their child a car, whereas a poor family just can't do it. They got to share cars, or if they even get to use cars at all. Whereas for, like, an upper class family, it shifts from, how am I pay, the middle class's perspectives, how am I going to pay for vacation, how am I going to, get that really nice car, how am I going to, in that line I thought, I'm not middle class. I don't really know the struggle. Like, literally, I just don't know the struggle, so I'm trying my best to just come up with it at that point. And then you have the upper class who's, it shifts from, like, oh, how am I going to pay for this for one vacation a year, to, like, how am I going to fit in all these vacations? How am I going to fit in all this stuff I got? Where am I going to store all my gold-plated toilet seats or something? Right? Like, that's the difference we're talking about here. At each level, there are difficulties to be faced, but the difficulties by no means are the same. By no means. I guess it's not easy being rich either, but, It's always going to be easier to be rich than it is going to be poor. But wealth ends up having a more pervasive effect on this, because the thing about wealth is that people take it as a token of people's like inherent value, right? So you would say like, oh, well, this person has money, and then they're like higher value, they're worth more, right? Like they're more important on some level than other people, right? And this kind of thinking is actually what's led to a lot of the worst things in human history, right? Like, I'm better than you. Like that, it's that mentality, the I'm better than you mentality for XYZ reasons, you know. Then the reasons don't matter. If you take a step and think, oh, I'm better than another person, you've already went down the wrong path. But it ends up, and historically has been an excuse to like treat other people poorly. You know, the most classic example of that would be like slavery, right? Because that's why that happened in the first place. Because these comparatively, quote unquote, wealthier people saw people who, you know, weren't as wealthy, weren't as well off, and made a judgment call about their inherent value being lesser than theirs, and then said, well, I can make you do whatever I want you to because, you know, I'm wealthy. You know, as much as people like to slam the white man for, you know, the white man's role in slavery, and there was a big role of the white man in slavery, the real issue here wasn't the white man beating down the doors of the, you know, whoever, because you know, African Americans or Africans, I guess at the time, were really the people who were affected most by it. But it's not like that was the limit to how treating people poorly or enslavement was sitting there and pulling people from Africa. No, it was done to all types of people, maybe in far lesser extent to a lot of different kinds, and it was always the wealthy doing it. You know, that poor farmer who was that poor peasant out in the field, like trying to grow potatoes, was never in the business of enslavement, right? They never they never went to Africa and pulled people out of Africa. It was the wealthier upper class, or people supplying the wealthy upper class, because it was the wealthy who had the demand for those things, because it was the wealthy who could afford those things in the first place. And I know I'm dehumanizing and objectifying people just because it's how it was viewed back in the day, but those were people that you were treating like that. Like, that's an important step to realize. And, you know, I guess it goes back to this whole, like, the societal structure that we've had before. And, you know, it changes over the world, but I guess I'm talking specifically about the king, the lord, the peasant, right? And so in, like, ancient times, it was the king. The king didn't just, like, rule everything. The king owned everything. Like, everybody in that kingdom was the property of the king, right? That was the king's kingdom. And they, like, granted the lords the, I guess, power to rule, or it happened at some point, and I guess that's how it started. I'm not sure if that's how it started or not, but the lords ended up becoming like the noble class, and there ended up being this like real especially in England, I guess is what I'm talking about specifically, but the lords did end up having enough influence and power to like sway the king to where the king couldn't just do anything to a lord. Although I imagine if a king wanted to head off of a lord, that would be what happened, although the lords were probably brought up in such a way as to where they, you know, didn't attract the ire of the royalty, right? And then they were just the peasants who the kings and the lords decided they were going to shit on whenever they wanted to because they felt like it, because, you know, they're just peasants, you know, they're just here to like be fodder for the workforce, right? Their only purpose in life would be to like go to the fields or like work in these, there weren't sweatshops in the time period I'm currently talking about, but like just slave away in the shops or whatever for the sake of, you know, like that's their purpose. That was how it was viewed. And I guess you can draw some parallels between that and today, because here's the thing is, like, we're not free from these ideas today. We're not free from the idea that wealthy people are inherently better than people who are of lower class. Because, like, think about the people who work, like, fairly lucrative jobs, right? Think about those people for a second. Say they make $40 an hour. I'm not sure what exactly where that line lays. Say there's somebody that makes $40 an hour, right? You know, they think that is representative of their own value. Like, I can make $40 an hour because I have this worth as a human being, right? And this worth is my claim to this amount of money per hour, right? And so you go down the ladder and you're like, well, here's the thing: is what do we need workers for more than anything? You know, that goes back to like before it was peasants working the fields, right? So people could have food or whatever. But those people were paid and made probably far less than anybody else ever thought about making. Now, what are those people now? Well, they're fast food workers, right? People who are in, because you can't go anywhere without seeing a fast food restaurant like just packing it up, and then it gets called unskilled labor, and so because it's quote unquote unskilled labor, you get paid like the bare minimum for it, the minimum wage typically, or maybe just slightly above that if you make like, you know, in some higher management roles or what have you. That ends up being their place in society. And you know, and I'm sure anybody who's heard this can like attest to, you know, how people talk about those jobs, because there's no honor in those jobs. There's no like prestige or fame in those jobs. It's just a job for money. And so you get treated like such in those type of work environments, because they're like, well, this is unskilled labor meant for like teenagers to like really get broken in, or you know, whatever, even though that's not the reality. That's not, you know, teenagers don't actually make up the majority of fast food workers, because that'd be an unsustainable, like you can't run businesses like that. But if every single fast food worker just up and decided that like they weren't going to work anymore, the fucking nation would go hungry. Like, let's be honest, how many people survive on fast food nowadays? How many people, like, there's a reason these places are packed out, because they're fast, easy, and convenient ways to get fed, to like meet our need for food, even if it's super unhealthy and, you know, a bit more expensive than what you'd want to pay for it. Or not more, that's not what I meant when I said that. It's, you know, it's a bit more expensive than just making the food yourself. That's what I wanted to say, typically. Despite all of that, you know, the country would come to a grinding halt if people couldn't go get their McDonald's or their Starbucks. Like, the country would actually, like, falter, because these people a lot of people couldn't function without their morning coffee, and they'd be lost if you said, well, just go brew a pot, right? You know, for me, if I want coffee, unless, like, I've been in a rush before, I really want to just, you know, take some stress out of my life, even though brewing a pot of coffee is not that hard. Like, you brew a pot and you fix it up yourself, because it ends up being a hell of a lot cheaper, and you know, getting the same thing. I mean, not the same thing. Like, I can make a latte at home. It's not going to be as good as something I get from Starbucks, but I can make a latte at home, right? There's no real reason to have to go out all the time, and maybe that's just the poor person in me speaking, right? Whereas, like, I am literally the me, where it's like, you know, Mom used to say all the time I had food at home. Now I am that person now, because I'm like, you know, that shit's expensive, unless I'm going to McDonald's and buying 2 McChickens, which aren't even $2 anymore. Like, McDonald's had the common decency to leave like McChickens on the dollar menu, so I go get 2 McChickens for like $2 or $3 or something. Now it's almost like $4. Right? And that's like as cheap as I can get food at McDonald's. But it's just not the same anymore. I was rambling. Sorry. I got sidetracked, but that happens. But here's what ties back into that, and it was like to the wealthy and to the rich and to the people who have more money or make more money, right? They see themselves as either having worked for that, like worked hard for that, or, you know, just being better on the basis of it if you were born into it. And so to the people who are, you know, higher up the socioeconomic totem pole, so to speak, it's being poor ends up being the fault of the poor. And so it's this way to like shirk responsibility for the fact that like these people are like barely making it and struggling to survive. And you look at and then people can look at them and say, well, that's their fault. And this is the same mentality people go at with like drug addicts, right? So a lot of people just like completely forget about that drug addicts exist in society, and just, you know, look at them as like the poorest excuse for what people can be. And the reason for this is that, well, it's their fault, right? You look at people and say, well, it's their fault. Well, you don't really look at rich people and say, it's your fault, you're a stuck-up fucking prick, and therefore I'm going to like treat you like shit. Well, I guess you can. Maybe I need a better example than that. But let's see. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that was all I had. But, you know, always the fault of the person, right? There are never like societal factors. There are never like this nuanced approach to these type of things, right? There's never like that critical analyzation of like what happens, how it happens, and why people are in the positions they are, and this lack of, I don't want to say sympathy, but empathy, because the people who look at the poor and look at the drug, I'm using drug addicts because it usually falls into the same camp, they look at these two groups of people and they're like, you know what, this is all on them. This is all on them. They're just not good enough. They fell into these traps that nobody else has fallen into, even though, rich people become drug addicts too, and those people get treated with, some kind of respect, because they're like, oh, this poor baby, like they've got such a bad disease that's affecting them in their lives. But if, you're poor, then it's like, oh, you fucking worthless prick, right? I mean, that's the viewpoint here. And it just serves, number one, to dehumanize the poor, the drug addicts, what have you, because like they're seen as less than. But it, means that you don't have to actually do anything about it, right? Whereas, I'm like, as a poor person, you're supposed to look at the rich and say, oh, well, they're so much better than me. They have so much more status. They did so much better than me. When, I can go up to a person who has money and I think they're a fucking idiot. But I'm still supposed to stand there and be like, yes, sir, like you are great, and you know what you're talking about. Whereas, and I'm just sick of that entirely. Like I take pride in what level of intelligence I do have, even if it sounds like I'm a fucking idiot when I speak on this podcast. I do take pride in the amount that I have, and I feel like that's my biggest asset as a person, is my ability to think and like not strategize necessarily, but to have my own opinion. Like, that's like why I'm here, is to have my own opinions. And so when I'm put into context and situations that, necessitate that I put those to the side, I put what I think to the side so I can perform this other duty or task, that's like an attack on my soul. It's an attack on who I am. Like, I don't get to be who I am anymore, because who I am is not just some fickle little, leaf floating in the wind at the whims of whatever happens around me. That's not me. And anybody who lets that be them just doesn't have respect for themselves, in my personal opinion, right? Because if you respected yourself, you wouldn't like compromise yourself for any reason. But like, you still determine who you are, and like, this gets into weird territory, because like the wording and verbiage I use makes it seem like, oh, well, there are certain things that just you don't do because it's honorable or undignified or what have you. But the thing is every person makes that decision for what's honorable and dignified for themselves, right? I can't tell you what honor looks like in another person. I can tell you what honor looks like to me. I can tell you that's like, hey, you don't go around like tricking people, even though that's like a cornerstone of today's society. You don't go around lying to people for no good reason, or even for reasons at all. Like, I really don't think it's even to get what you want or to like achieve a specific outcome, because I see lying as on its face to anybody for any reason as either dirty or manipulative. Because what are you doing when you lie? Like, if you lie to somebody, say you're in a situation to where like the quote unquote moral thing to do would be to lie to them to like get their attention, or to like just change some outcome, right? You walk away from that thinking that's not dirty, and you walk away from that thinking that that's not wrong. Well, sure, but what you did was literally a form of manipulation, because you're trying to elicit a certain type of response from me, because you think that response that I'm going to have is not favorable in that situation, whereas my response is my own, right? To where like, I am entitled to have my own responses and opinion to things. That's like my right as a human being. But you're trying to affect and manipulate that, and that's not wrong, because of some weird contextualization to where you have now contextualized that being right. Whereas if I turned around and decided that's how I wanted to act, it'd be a bad thing, right? But to me, that it just enforces like a weird double standard, to where it's like, well, sometimes it's okay to be a piece of shit, and sometimes it's not okay to be a piece of shit. And it's like, no, either just like make up your mind. It's okay to be a piece of shit, or it's not. There's no like subtle nuance to every single interaction you have with every other person, because to have that subtle nuance like that means you literally have no honor. right? There's no honor in people. Maybe I'm just a fool for thinking there's such a thing as honor in the first place, because like, and that to me, that's the same thing as like people are like in professionally how you like carry yourself, right? Like that's honor. Like people can say whatever it is. People are like, well, you need to act a certain way because this is like how you're supposed to act. This is how you're supposed to uphold yourself, because this is how it's reasonable to act in society. And it's like the only thing that matters to me is whether or not I can sleep at night, right? Whether or not I've lived a life that like I'm unproud of, or not. I wasn't a life I'm proud of. Why I added the un, I have no idea. Like that's what I'm looking for at the end of the day, right? And for me to live a life I'm personally proud of, I gotta, sometimes do things that people don't like. Because, like, that means, like, sometimes people are like, you just need to shut your mouth. And sometimes you do need to just shut your mouth. But if I'm having to constantly go through my head and say, you need to shut the fuck up, the chances are I just don't need to be in that situation to begin with, right? Because obviously it's causing some amount of distress that, either I just deal with all the time, which, a lot of people do, for various different reasons. They just, be quiet and get on with their day. And it's like, well, to me, that ends up becoming like a weight you can't bear. And it's like, well, you bottle all that up and you take it to therapy. And it's like, I shouldn't have to go to therapy for just living my fucking life, man. Like, I shouldn't have to, like, expose myself to situations to where I'm literally going through mental distress regularly just to survive, right? And then just because of the way that society is functioning and the way people expect you to act, right? Because it's okay. Well, I'm gonna pull myself out of the hat for a second, because this is really what happens to me. Like, it's okay that I spend my time alone. It's okay that I don't really have any close friends, and it's okay that I'm just some washed out, burnout, gifted kid, former gifted kid, whatever, right? That's all okay. But what's not okay is if I try to change that. That ends up becoming, or I end up trying to change that in the ways that seem to me to be the most obvious, right? Like, I can't, for instance, every time that I have ever had a crush on a girl and tried to pursue it, it's always ended badly, right? And the advice I get from a lot of people is just, you need to lower your standards, right? Like, this is, like, I'm not bullshitting, pulling anybody's, like, this is what people tell me. Like, you just need to, tone it back a little bit and just not go for people that you actually like. And to me, that's akin to, like, not wanting to do it at all. Like, because it takes, there's a reason I don't put in the effort to go after every single, like, there's a reason people don't put in the effort to go after every single person they see that they're ever attracted to or that they ever want, right? Or that every other person in the world, right? You have to have this set of people who are like, because you have a limited amount of time and energy. And if I just went after everybody I saw, I'd never get anywhere. I might get somewhere with one person, but it'd be like something I don't want and something I didn't even want to pursue in the worst place. And I'm putting effort into something that I don't actually want to pursue. And you're like, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do. Like that ends up being like, just put all your effort in shit you don't actually want to do, and maybe you'll get somewhere. And it's like, no, that's not. That's just misusing my time and energy on things that aren't important to me, right? And maybe people don't see it that way. Maybe people see it like, oh, well, no, that's just the way the world works. And sure, maybe that's the way the world works. But if that's the way the world works, and I reject the way the world works, and will actually just live the way I want to live. Right? Because that's all people really want to do, is that people want to live their life the way they want to live. They want to live it free. But when straddled with so many different, like, rules and, like, ways of conducting yourself, you don't get to be free. They say you get to be free within a certain, like, cage, pretty much. Like, as long as you stay within this cage, you can do whatever you want. It's like, no, I want to bust out of the cage entirely. I don't want anybody telling me anywhere I gotta go or anything I gotta do. And to me, that's what it would mean to be free. And, like, I don't see how you get to simultaneously say, like, we're all free men and, like, we all get to do whatever we want, whenever you're, like, you're completely held by the balls, like, by societal expectations, right? Maybe I just don't see a way for society to exist at the same time that, freedom exists. Maybe that makes me an anarchist, but, that is what it is. Like, I call it like I see it. I'm not making a judgment call on whether anarchism Our society is better because it's like there's a definite what's the word? There's a definite claim to be said that society is better because people aren't dying all the time, and like we have some type of structure. Well, sure, but like don't kid yourself into thinking it's free. Maybe it's a degree of freedom that you can actually withstand, but it's not free. I can't go out and do whatever the hell I want. That's freedom, right? Nobody can tell me what I can't do. That's freedom. But we have laws, we have rules, and like the question becomes, at what point is it too much? And it seems like there just keeps being added more and more and more and more because like this is how you're supposed to act, this is how you're supposed to do it. And it just seems like too much to me at some point. Maybe that's not the right call. Maybe that makes me an asshole. Sure, whatever you want to call me. I don't really care. Because all of this ties into like status though, because that's what we're talking about, right? Because people look at like what you wear, what you drive, where you live, what kind of phone you got, and they and people just instinctively make a judgment call about how much value you have, and that value gets used to like determine your place in the social structure, right? And so if you like have expensive things and you have nice clothes or nice phones and you got like a lawyer for a dad or whatever, like you're just held at a higher status inherently by social structures because that's how they view all this shit. And if you don't have those things, well, you might as well just not even bother, pretty much, because like, well, there will be a few number of people who are like empathizing with you, like, man, like it sucks, and they're like trying to reach out, but like at the end of the day, they're not going to like go out of their way to like make you feel better because you don't have that social structure. But like, if you were rich, they'd probably like be right there for you, or if you had different like you would have been invited to the parties in the first place, right? And this really gets seen with women, and like I guess I don't need to tell everybody, like women, it's said that more mature women actually go after wealth because they want some like financial stability, security, and a provider, right? That's one way of looking at it, and that's like kind of like the way it works. But that means that all the women are going after the wealthy men, and the poor men are just not seen as good enough to be like worthy partners, right? And do you see where what that parallels? That whole value of a person coming from how much wealth they have. I mean, there just doesn't seem to have it, and nobody seems to have an issue with it. Maybe I do. Maybe I got an issue with it. Maybe I just have an issue with it because it means that I'm just like a fucking piece of shit to everybody else, right? And maybe I can't sit around and just, let myself think of myself as a piece of shit like the rest of society does. Maybe that's not good for me either. It doesn't change how everybody else thinks of me, but it doesn't mean I have to look at myself and say, you fucking piece of shit, right? I can thank it because of this shit, but I can reject it every time it shows up because like that's just not a good way to survive. And here's an example of how wealth actually works. Because to the rich, wealth is a luxury, right? They have their gold-plated toilet seats, their Lamborghinis, and their 3-story mansions or what have you. But to the poor, wealth is a necessity. Right? The rich don't worry about where they're getting the next meal from. The rich don't worry about whether or not they're going to have power or water or a cell phone next month. To the poor, all of this is like something they have to like worry about all the time, constantly, because if they mismanage their money even just a little bit, well, what bill are we not going to pay this month? What payment am I not going to be able to make this month? Are they going to come take the car this month, right? That ends up being the questions, but it's all tied back into the same thing. But like to the whole wealth being a necessity to the poor is the whole reason that work even functions in the first place. Like the whole structure for work, especially when it comes to minimum wage jobs like fast food. And why? Well, because if I sat here and I told you like, oh hey, like you need to work 40 hours a week doing like you need to paint walls for 40 hours a week for the rest of your life. Like, I didn't like say, oh, you do it 8 hours a day, blah, blah, 40 hours, just say 40 hours a week. You'd be like, you're fucking crazy, right? Like, I'm not doing that. Like, what do you mean I'm doing that? And they're like, well, what if I offer you $7.25 an hour? Is that really going to change how you view doing that? No, not really, but it's like what's being offered. And it's like, well, you can accept $7.25 an hour to do this for 40 hours a week, or you can die. And that ends up being like the options here. And so people work to survive at jobs which aren't really worth their effort or time, where the expectation from the employers is that they're doing you a service by allowing you to work your ass off and be treated like shit in the first place, right? And somehow this is considered the norm, and somehow this is considered humane and just. You know, I know that, you know, we've come a long way from how shit used to be, but just think about all this shit for a second. Is it? You know? And why is it that the jobs that seem to like hold up society, I don't have a doubt in my mind if fast food and like minimum wage jobs suddenly went out, like the world wouldn't function anymore. But despite this, they're paid less than anybody else. Like, don't get me wrong, like doctors are important, right? But if all the doctors often died, yeah, we have a lot of people that aren't getting medical treatment that they were before. But people would still be eating, right? People would still have houses. But if you got rid of fast food workers, I guess the house is about it. If you got rid of fast food workers, a lot of people just wouldn't be eating food like they were before. If you got rid of like Walmart workers, a lot of people wouldn't be able to go to the store anymore, right? If you got rid of, I don't know, pizza delivery guys, you know, a lot of people would be skipping on pizza a lot. Just as an example. But moving on, there's this, you know, wealth is very closely tied to money, and there's, you know, that comment, I think it's an idiom, is the expression, the name for it, that money is the root of all evil. Well, I say that's bullshit. Money isn't the root of all evil, because money's just a thing. If you want to look at the real root of all evil, look who created money, and that's just man. Right? At the heart of every immoral action that's ever been performed in the history of mankind, yeah, there might be a money or greed motivation behind a lot of them, but every single time when you get down to the nitty-gritty, it's somebody doing it. It's a person doing it. Man's the root of all evil, and if you're just throwing it off on money, it's just allowing you to avoid the reality that people aren't as good as you think they are. You know, I don't think people are inherently good or bad, or even like the most evil person is like an absolute evil. Like, I think it's a lot of gray there, right? There is nuance in there to that, but I like to say that man's capacity for good is also man's capacity for evil. And so you can think like, and that's scary, right? Because the most touted story of like the good of humanity is like the story of Jesus Christ, so where it's like he died for everybody's sins. And like I'm just using this as a story example point. But if that's like the most absolute good of like humankind, then the most absolute evil would be like somebody destroying the world for their own selfish reasons. And I think that people just know that the depths of that kind of evil exist just as much as the depths of that kind of good. So, or the, not depths, but heights of that other good. And, you know, everything doesn't just work out like that, because people tend to be greedy. And it means people want it all, right? And this is especially true with the rich, because like, say, like the poor people can't even afford to like pay half the shit they got, but you have like people like the richest people in the world, and I guess Warren Buffett, because he's just the name that comes to head, people like that who like just try to avoid paying all the taxes they can so they can keep all their money, right? Now, I'm not saying that like in truth that in reality that like, oh, all the money should go to U.S. government, no, so they can use it to wage war or do bullshit, you know, or like get the African American communities hooked on crack, right? Like, no, like the government isn't above corruption as well. The government isn't above good or evil. The government isn't good or evil. It just, what it does can be labeled as like good or evil things. But at the same time, like, we have tons of billionaires. Well, not tons. We have a few billion. But like, these people got so much money they don't know what to do with, and they're just thinking of ways to keep it all to themselves, right? You don't see like the richest people in the world donating like all but, say $100,000 of their salary to like causes. No, they might give like $100,000 or maybe even $1 million to help like poor people, right? It's their charity, their charity work. They get a tax write-off and they get to, look good and favorable in the eyes of people. But like, if they really wanted to tackle the issues facing that country, it's going to take like their money and just completely redistributing it to the people who need it the most. And they're not going to do that, even if logistically it could work. I'm not saying logistically it could work at all. They're not doing that. And that would be something like what it would take. And it's like the whole, I swear I don't try to sound like a, seize the means of production communist on here. Like, it's like, I don't actually think that's the best system in the world, but it has, number one, its appeal, and, there's some truth that working that way is the only way to lift people out of poverty in the way that's really, like, substantial. Now, if that's your goal, a lot of people's goal isn't to, abolish the poor. I don't mean to kill them either. There aren't very many people who are like, well, I don't want people to live in poverty anymore. Like, let's be honest. Like, people don't care, and that ends up being like the reason shit happens, because people are like, well, I'm poor. Other people got to suffer too. And it's like, wouldn't you like to create a world where people didn't suffer at all? Isn't that the goal? Like, I know that there's a certain school of thought to where like human existence is suffering, and I think in our current like world that is true. But in the most ideal of worlds, there would be in a utopia, which I know will never exist. In a utopia, there would be no such thing as suffering for anybody. Nobody would suffer. Nobody would be in pain. I mean, I know you can't attain those things, but shouldn't you try to minimize that to the greatest extent that you can? Isn't that like the goal? Isn't that why we have like houses? So we don't suffer through the elements. Isn't that why we have food? So we don't suffer through hunger. Why do we have the internet? So we don't suffer through boredom. In totality, like this whole idea of wealth and status and people sitting above one another and like this person here, this person there, and people below being shitty, is created this like pseudo structure. I say pseudo because, and it's probably a weird way to describe it, because it's an actual structure, but it's like there are all these rules and ways that the rich and the powerful have decided that people are supposed to act, and you must act this way in order to like make it at all. Like, you must be courteous to the people who are at higher status than you, and you must respect people with more money. And like, to me, it just seems like a holdover from whenever there were lords and kings, right? To where the people who still sat at the top still expected the respect that came from money, and that's just carried over into today, and people just kind of like passively accept it, because like, to a lot of the people who have a lot of wealth, they think that their wealth entitles them to respect, right? Whereas to me, respect is something entirely different, because to me, respect is something you'll show me in return, right? I don't respect people who don't respect me. I don't care who you are or where you are. I don't care if you're like Jesus Christ himself. If Jesus Christ came up to me, like was alive today, and spat on my shoes and called me a piece of shit, like I would not respect that man because of what he just did, all right? I don't care who he is, Son of God or not. Maybe that's just, I don't want to say grandiose, but like bullheaded of me, and like stubborn. Like, oh, of course you wouldn't just let that shit go for the Son of God. And it's like, well, no, because they didn't respect me. Like, I don't respect people who don't respect me, because that gets you in a whole bunch of trouble too. As much as you're told to respect people who don't respect you like that, because they have more money or because they're their boss or whatever, it doesn't actually get you anywhere except making you look like a complete fool, idiot, and for lack of a better term, a bitch. I know that can be a bit misogynistic, but I swear I mean it in the most. Well, I do mean it in the most derogatory way, I suppose, but I don't mean it in reference to women specifically. I mean it as in like. I'm done explaining myself. All right. In today's society, like there aren't, at least in the past, like at least when there were serfs and peasants working the land, like they could have some amount of honor in what they did. right? At least like maybe it's not like the most dignified work, but like when you go and you like make swords or armor or work the fields, or there is some honor to that because you're doing shit that like matters. But now we've created a society where there is no honor at the bottom. Like there is no honor in working at Walmart. There is no honor in working in fast food. There is no honor in doing any of these minimum wage jobs at all. And maybe it's showing because people don't care about those jobs. People don't care to work at like Walmart. They're like, fuck this job. Like everybody who works minimum wage jobs, like, fuck this job. All right? Whereas maybe at some point in the past, there were professions and things of the sort. Professions, careers, whatever I think it was more or less like family locked to where you were destined to do what your dad did. In the society I'm talking about, I don't think that's how it always works, but hold on, I lost my train of thought. I do that a lot. I wish I didn't. But like, there was some honor in this stuff, right? Like, I made swords for, I guess, the king or the nobles or for the fellow soldiers or armor, right? And, I delivered all these potatoes so that people ate this week, You could take some pride in that. You can't take pride in slapping together a McChicken and shoving it out the window while somebody's yelling at you, right? You can't, there isn't pride there. There isn't honor in that. And maybe that's what we need to bring back in the world. Maybe just abolish everything that doesn't allow somebody to have pride in what they do. And I guess that the fast food joints are doing their best to try to like give pride back into it, because like Taco Bell is completely like, they're not like, you don't have cooks, you have food service champions, right? They're trying to make you feel better about that shitty job that you have by giving it a different title, even though that's not really how this shit works. Right, you feel a little bit better because they're saying it's a little bit better, but saying something just doesn't make it true. Like, you gotta have all the evidence to back it up. And I think I'm gonna cut it at this point because I've been rambling for over 40 minutes. And I mean, it might not be after 40 minutes after I do some cuts and make it, a little more palatable and remove some of the odd noises that got put up in the silence and some of my awkward pauses. But anyway. This has been the Lost Souls Podcast. I've been your host, Alex, and hope you have a nice day. Peace out.